Happy Monday. We are back with Bring the Jury for our 15th episode. This is Bring the Jury, where we talk about a series of different cases nationwide that are popular and trending. You may have hopped on the Bring the Jury train back when we were covering all things Alec Murdaugh, which has now led to the Stephen Smith investigation, which is what we're going to be discussing today. I'm here with Luke and Brian Sheely, the twins that run the Sheely Law Firm here in South Carolina. We're at the Columbia office, but there's also a Charleston location as well, ranging from all things from stop signs to murder, criminal defense, all the way to personal injury. These guys can represent you.
Sometimes murdering a stop sign.
And sometimes murdering a stop sign. There you go. You can always follow along with us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn for the intellectuals, Twitter for those of you who like to argue, and all the other social medias in between. If you happen to miss any bits of this live podcast, you can always catch the full episode posted the following day. Also uploaded to most streaming platforms. Apple's still
pending?
Still pending. We just have our application out there and just hoping for them to approve us.
Why does Apple hate?
I don't know. I had the same problem when I did my podcast.
Okay.
They're just behind. But anyways, so we're going to go ahead and get started today with Stephen Smith. If you have any burning questions that you would like answered, go ahead and drop them in the comments. I see that we have some debate on Fanta flavors. Love to hear it. We got a Diet Mountain Dew fan in the group.
Do the do.
Do the do.
Ain't nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. If you have any questions about Stephen Smith throughout this live broadcast, feel free to drop them. I'll be monitoring TikTok. I'm not just texting while on the job.
Some people think you...
Some people think I'm just texting.
Like what?
I'm disinterested in my own podcast.
She's like, that girl's so rude.
And there's also a lot of critique of your texting style, which apparently is advanced or either subpar. I'm not sure which, but...
Weigh in. But we're just going to go ahead and dive right in with Stephen Smith. Maybe just giving a quick overview for those of you who aren't familiar. Stephen Smith, his body was found on Sandy Run Road in Hampton, South Carolina, July 7th, 8th, I believe. But his death was ruled a hit and run initially. And after Netflix and HBO and all of the listeners across the country became so sensationally invested in the Murdaugh trial, they likewise became invested in Stephen Smith's death, wondering if it really was a hit and run or if there was something more to be found there. So recently, they have they exhumed the body?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to talk about that today. So they've exhumed the body, and we've also got a list of new potential suspects. Some of you may be watching thinking that Buster Murdaugh may have had something to do with this. Think again, because we've got a long list of suspects and none of them to be Buster, I believe.
Right. Well, just so setting the table for what's happened so far. So, Sandy Smith, who was Stephen's mom when he was killed in 2015, it was initially labeled a hit and run. And we've cut one of our last pods, and maybe 2 pods ago, kind of covered the initial groundwork for that. He was basically found in the middle of the road, close to his home, about 2 miles away from his disabled vehicle that appeared to be out of gas. His wallet was left in the car. The gas tank opening was kind of open. And he was found 2 miles down the road with blunt force trauma injury. And that just generally means, a massive head injury. There were no tire marks. There was no shattering of glass. There was no blood spatter. There were, the initial investigation by law enforcement, specifically the Highway Patrol in South Carolina, they normally are the experts when it comes to vehicular accidents and vehicular related homicide. They basically got on scene and were noting all the things I just stated. Also things like his shoes were loosely tied and they were still on, and also kind of noting from their experience that his injuries seem to be pretty specific not necessarily your normal, I got hit by a large vehicle at a high rate of speed kind of trauma. The pathologist, Luke, is heavily criticized. I'm going to leave that to Luke in a second because he loves talking about forensics. But before we get to that, I'll just say, we've covered the difference between a coroner and a pathologist, and a coroner in South Carolina is generally kind of an official, an elected official that is there to deal with bodies, removing them. They do, however, upon input, get to kind of write that death certificate and state the official cause of death. And in 2015, in Hampton, it was this guy named Ernie Washington, and there's been a lot of coverage of this, and it seems like, some people want to blame Mr. Washington for causing the chaos. Some people want to herald Mr. Washington as the voice of truth early on, but he initially was there on the scene, there on the road with local law enforcement, and was kind of pointing out in his experience what he believed to be a gunshot wound to Mr. Smith's head. And so, there's been some supplemental data on him and reporting, and he, was the coroner. He also owned a funeral home. He had a lot of experience
looking at
dead people and kind of understanding generally, hit and run folks that are coming into, his official duty as coroner and also coming into his funeral home, I imagine. So he is pointing out to law enforcement, check out this bullet wound, Luke.
Right, and I was pretty candid about a few podcasts ago about what kind of weight do we give the coroner's assessment, and I said
zero, hardly any.
And it is an elected position, and there's very minimal qualifications for it. It is interesting that he owned a funeral home, so again, he looks at bodies probably, but he's, getting them presentable for funerals and other things. There's no requirement really to own a funeral home other than you're a business owner and that you meet certain DHEC standards. So of course, again, him believing that was a gunshot wound and getting and law enforcement as well, kind of going, it looks like a gunshot wound, really kind of stirred up this frenzy that the pathologist debunked. So actually, a little side note, speaking to our Richland County coroner Rutherford last week on a case involving a body in a somewhat unique circumstance, and she's actually medically trained as a nurse or a nurse practitioner, so it was kind of refreshing to see that and knowing that's her background, so that's pretty cool because she can talk medical and also give public statements regarding investigations and causes of death. So that's a good thing. Kudos Richland County electorate for electing her in. But that was the start of the chaos. Dr. Presnell, who was a pathologist, much maligned pathologist in 2015 at MUSC, who did the autopsy, just said, no, we've covered it. There's no bullet wound. There's no fragments. There's no projectiles. There's no gunshot residue.
There's no glass from a vehicle in Mr. Smith's body.
Right.
Now, she, by the way, is now head of MUSC pathology department on today's date, of Charleston. So she, back then, was a pathologist, and now she's the head. She's training other pathologists. She's, must be well respected at MUSC.
Right, and so that, given the attention of the Alex Murdaugh case and the fact that Buster was just loosely thrown into this investigation or this search,
understatement,
which is an understatement, and the sensationalness and the public appetite for anything Murdaugh, that's honestly, folks, that's why we're here, because again, we've covered this. There's plenty of grieving mothers that don't feel that their loved one's deaths were adequately investigated or they had sufficient answers. They don't feel like they had justice, but the bottom line is here, without this public attention and a GoFundMe that really helped Miss Smith generate $125,000, I think, then there just wouldn't be the appetite for it. People aren't going to GoFundMe for Joe Blow's dead child that died, 10 years ago of a suspicious kind of cause. They're just not, and otherwise the case just stays dead. So this case is very much alive. We have a very fancy private autopsy that has been done.
Well, let's talk about that in just a second.
Okay.
Back to 2015, though, as Luke said, Dr. Presnell basically, much to the Highway Patrol kind of investigating officer, Proctor, he was very much believing this not to be a hit and run, thinking that it was something, non-vehicular related. And so, for all the reasons we stated, no accident type indicators, no tire marks from braking, no glass, the way the body was there kind of appeared not to be dragged at all. And again, we have acute kind of head trauma versus larger body trauma. And so, and he's again there on the scene with the coroner talking about a bullet wound. And so he learns in 2015 from Dr. Presnell that it was just a hit and run. So he is very much, I think at the time, very personally invested in this investigation. And so he, per reports, actually goes and shows up at the pathologist's office, Dr. Presnell, and he's knocking at her door. And I think the quote from him is that he received a very negative response from her when he was questioning her, calling it a hit and run death. He said, well, what do you mean? There's all these other indicators. And she was basically like, well, that's your job to figure out those things. I'm just here to tell you cause of death. And it's not a homicide. It is a vehicular related hit and run. And he was pressing her some more. And she says, well, the body was found on the road, essentially. And then, then the coroner, per this Highway Patrol investigator, changed his opinion. And again, the coroners very often are relying on the pathologist. They may even make kind of an initial impression, but he completely changes his opinion. And this very much, I think, aggrieved the Highway Patrol investigator. And that's clear from his report that he was upset about that and thought that was not the right way to go. And then the case was ultimately kind of investigated in a limited way. And then it was just a hit and run, like there are many hit and runs in South Carolina and throughout the country. They did some follow-ups and the case went cold for all these years. And then, with the notoriety of the Murdaugh investigation, for right or wrong, trying to link the family to this case, and then that has caused a lot of ability for Stephen Smith's mom to raise money. So yes, now we've got a exhumation. We've had Stephen Smith's body has been exhumed.
SLED already said they believed it's a murder case. They won't say why, but they said we view it as a homicide. And they intertwine homicide and murder. They have.
Right.
And so that's where we are prior to this exhumation. We also have lots of press announcements from Sandy Smith's attorneys and how they want to give her peace and give her justice, and that they're just looking for the truth.
And it's just, for those viewers that didn't watch our last pod, it is very, very unlikely for SLED to typically just reverse course and call something a hit and run. And, that means it could have been an accident. It could have been intentional, but certainly no one's found. And it's definitely related to a vehicle in the middle of the road. And then for them to reverse course publicly, really before they even exhumed Mr. Smith's body, they just said we're treating this as a murder investigation. We've got lots of different leads, opening up, and it's murder. And so that doesn't happen. Major law enforcement, and this is the biggest law enforcement agency in South Carolina, doesn't just reverse course. I mean, we will see it sometimes in like a cold case investigation where they go out and they're hitting the beat and they got their cold case investigators really putting the pressure on witnesses that maybe they need to re-interview, putting them on a polygraph, breaking them on a polygraph, combined with other DNA analysis. We've seen that happen, and they go, yep, my bad. And we've actually defended folks on those types of cases where our client was later charged and they, got a confession out of him, and then they're apologizing to the initial defendant's family. But this is really, really early. I mean, they haven't really released any new information, and they don't have any other forensic information, and we don't have information about them squeezing anyone else at this point. So, I mean, it's a pretty kind of big, bold move by Mark Keel and SLED.
Yes, I'd love to know what they have. I just think it's honestly, really the Murdaugh trial. SLED got very invested. The Attorney General's office got very invested. They had an egg on their face for several important reasons. So this is kind of solidifies their stance that they got a conviction, and this was remotely related, at least by rumor. And if there's anything to do with it, we are 100% going to give justice to Miss Smith, although it appears to have nothing to do with any Murdaugh. And I think Sandy Smith's lawyers have said as much at this point in public information, so good for them. But the only reason she has that $125,000 is due to that connection.
Right, and back to Erin Presnell, the pathologist. I mean, she's been around for a long time. Just some of the reporting that we're looking at here is that she did the autopsies on the, Emanuel 9, the shooting in 2015 of, down in Charleston that Dylan Roof was ultimately convicted of. That was about 3 weeks prior to this. And the reporting we're looking at talks about, she had intensive autopsies, the weeks leading up to this, where she was working long hours and that kind of stuff. It's just kind of thrown in there. But she has done a number of high-profile kind of cases, and she's vastly experienced. So it'll be interesting. Right now, she is not giving any public reporting, on these events. I mean, she's probably under a lot of scrutiny. There's probably, anything she does now with such a high press case is only going to come back to bite her. I mean, right now she's authored an expert opinion. And if she gets out and tries to defend herself in the media, it's not going to be a good look for her, because either she's going to say the same thing and maybe say it slightly differently, and then kind of gather scrutiny, or she's going to try to defend herself, and that's never a good look for a doctor.
One of the other things I think is important that kind of, at least from some of this reporting, is to talk to one of her colleagues that really supports her initial finding, at least per one of her colleagues, is that in her report it says that the brain stem was separated from Mr. Smith's spinal cord. So to her, that is an indication of a significant amount of whiplash that would separate your brainstem from your spinal cord, which really corroborates kind of a motor vehicle collision type impact versus just being hit with a bat or something like that, which was one of the theories that investigator Proctor had. So that's, again, another pretty crucial piece of medical information, not speculation, which is why she gave the opinion that she did in 2015. So I'm on pins and needles. I'm very curious as to what the new pathologist would say down in Florida.
And just for the record, the new pathologist, and it's really a team of pathologists and assistants, and this is led by Dr. Dan Schultz, and he is the chief pathologist this is a private pathology group called Final Diagnosis. It sounds pretty intense.
It's like a movie title.
And
Final Destination.
And he, is being assisted by some, a team in his group. He's got a forensic anthropologist as well is involved in this. I mean, basically, this is not a normal autopsy where the body is relatively intact enough and the death is recent enough where they can kind of do their job. I mean, they're going to have to get a forensic anthropologist involved who already is involved. And that is Dr. Heather Walsh Haney, who's at Florida Gulf Coast University in Fort Myers, Florida. And they got this team, and the forensic anthropologist is going to have to, like you would think in anthropological terms, kind of reconstruct some of the body aspects to assist the pathologist. So it's really a specialized field. They've also got part of their team, as a lot of our viewers and listeners will recall from the Murdaugh trial, Kenny Kinsey, Luke.
Kenny Kinsey.
Kenny Kinsey. So he's been hired.
Crime scene expert who I did my now famous broom recreation
Yes, it is famous.
of the shooting of the shotgun.
That's all my family talked about at Easter.
You know,
Oh,
gosh, if only I had that broom in that courtroom with Dr. Kinsey, we could have had a good old discussion. But he became, not saying he wasn't famous before, but his fame has shot into the stratosphere, and he is now part of this team looking to take leads and run with it.
And Kinsey was probably the star witness for both sides on the Murdaugh trial. I mean, he was intensely intelligent. He was also very charismatic
Very folksy.
in a folksy country way, which was very. You can't really cross-examine that. I mean, he was
To the crowd.
He was great. Now, I will say this, Dr. Kinsey, he was making fun in the Murdaugh trial of all the out-of-state hired experts. And now he's teamed up with some out-of-state hired experts.
Oh, man.
So, he was making fun of...
They're good now. It's okay now.
I mean, we'll
It's
see.
good.
We'll see.
We got a lot of out-of-state money hiring out-of-state experts.
But we do have a lot of respect for Dr. Kinsey, so it'll be interesting to see how he kind of is involved in this. And he's already making public statements to Court TV that he is considering 4 or 5 different scenarios of how Stephen Smith could have died, but he's very interested in the pathology, the new pathology, to see what that uncovers. And of course, for SLED to really do anything with this new information, it's got to be provided. I imagine that will not be a problem. But so we have a whole host of new experts that are working hard. And, they're going to do a couple things. They're going to either say, we cannot determine anything different from what, Dr. Presnell determined. Or they're going to say, yeah, this is what we find her to be incorrect. She was, for whatever reasons at the time, just didn't get it right, was stressed or whatever, but we find it to be 180 degree different. We think it was XYZ is the cause of death, related, could have been caused in these different reasons. And then we've got, support for a murder charge. Now, they still have to find an identity of somebody, but that would then have to be kind of adopted by SLED. And so then SLED's put in this position where they have to not only now have they reverse course on this being a hit and run to full-on murder investigation, if this hotshot group of pathologists and anthropologists and Dr. Kinsey says, here's how it really went down, SLED would then have to basically say, our own initial state pathologist, who's the head of MUSC, is wrong. And so what that does is it kind of is a built-in way for, if anyone ever gets charged in this case, it's a built-in way to impeach the integrity of the investigation. What do I mean by that?
Well, that's a defendant's constitutional right protected by due process in the 14th Amendment to say, hey, there's fundamentally reasonable doubt in this case because even their doctor, their SLED agents on scene thought it was a hit and run, not a murder, non-intentional killing, and they left it in 2015 because guess what? There's nothing to see, and guess what? There's still nothing to see. So that's what a lawyer could do. Now, law enforcement doesn't like to be in that position, but they will if the occasion arises. It's uncomfortable. Brian and I once had a very high-profile murder case where at first they charged the husband for the wife's killing, and the friend was a star witness for 2 trials that the state had with law enforcement putting him up saying that he was an eyewitness to the murder. And then the husband was acquitted, and so they took a fresh set of eyes on it and gave it to some new investigators, kind of a lot like what we're hearing in the papers here about a fresh set of eyes. and went and really turned the screws on the friend, and turns out he confessed to the murder. And now they were charging him, even though objectively they had all that evidence all along, or subjectively they were just looking for someone to blame. So we were faced with that trial where we had 2 trials ahead of us of them blaming someone else. So that was quite an interesting case, and something where law enforcement was squirming quite a bit as well. So it can happen, but it is not the ideal setup for any law enforcement agency.
No, and just looking at the final autopsy, in this Dr. Schultz, Dan Schultz, Final Diagnosis is his company. He does this a lot. I mean, it seems like he is very accustomed to being retained to come in for failed initial pathology opinions, or either people that just want another opinion, and getting involved. I mean, it seems like that's kind of his niche. He's also been featured on the television series Alcatraz, Search for the Truth, which was produced by the History Channel. So this is kind of his jam. I mean, he's in private practice. He gets, I'm sure, hired all around the country to kind of come in and do the best job. And it's always good when you even name your company name as like the final say on things. So that's either clever marketing or he's just really good. I don't know.
It should be the correct opinion.
The final opinion. So look him up, Dr. Dan Schultz. He's out of Florida, and we'll see what he's made of. Just looking at other developments, in the Stephen Smith, exhumation. I mean, essentially, SLED was there when his body was exhumed. So, they're going to do their own kind of investigative techniques. If they're doing their job right, they've got some of their CSI people taking notes, photographing how it was done. Even simple things, in terms of, who was on the scene. I mean, typically in a crime scene, there's a log of people that are there. So I'm sure this would have been done in a very secure way, and they will have documented it. And then if anything comes to this, it'll have to be turned over if anyone ever gets charged. But just, now that SLED is back on the case, so to speak, calling this a murder investigation, they're doing a couple things that they could have done previously. We've got a number of suspects that we'll get to it in a little bit, but we've got a couple of things they always had that now they're looking into. I mean, they always had Stephen Smith's cell phone, and if you kind of listen to any true crime, docuseries or podcasts, or even the Murdaugh case, I mean, you can get a lot out of a cell phone. You can get geographical data, location data, you can get text messages, call records, you can get social media history,
positioning and rotation of the phone,
data,
step data.
So all this stuff that you can do, it appears it maybe wasn't done, but SLED is now reporting that they are taking a crack at Stephen's phone. They're able to unlock it. They're also able to unlock a tablet that he had.
I think it was lost at one point.
Okay.
The iPad, they couldn't find it, but yes, someone asked about that. The iPad, according to this and a few other reports, has been located and is in their custody, and they're going to also get into that.
Yeah, I mean, so this is always standard stuff. I mean, and maybe it just didn't happen at the time for whatever reasons, whether it was disinterest or just the hit and run kind of potential accident classification of this death kind of shut it down pretty quickly in terms of SLED. I mean, obviously there's a lot of attention on it now, as Luke indicated, from a media standpoint. There's so much notoriety on this kind of situation and interest in it, and SLED is trying to make amends maybe, but they're doing basic stuff. This is investigation 101. They're looking at the phones, looking at who's the last person Stephen spoke to, who you take a call from. Is there any video evidence that could assist? I mean, obviously, who did he talk to last? We'll get to that in a little bit, is very key. And so, but they're looking at that, and you can either get into that by someone that knows the password to these devices, or you can unlock it, which can be done through various law enforcement techniques. They've got software that helps them crack it. Luke's had cases where they have to send it to the FBI, and it takes a year.
Yeah, and they've asked us for various passcodes, and sometimes we tell them to pound sand, and they send it to the CIA or the FBI and do code breaking. So it just depends. But this, like Brian said, it was something they always had, but probably because it was ruled more of a vehicular accident, whether intentional or not, very little to say it was intentional at that point. They probably just let the case die on the vine and didn't really have a pressing need to explore the relationships that might be developed within the cell phone and laptop that could identify someone who might want him dead.
The other thing of note in terms of evidence, so really we don't have a whole lot of evidence in terms of new evidence other than they're unlocking the phones. One thing that has made the news is that, often in a death case and certainly in a rape allegation, they'll do what's commonly referred to as a rape kit. And this is a forensic kind of, if someone is living, a nurse will be taking a sample, from a sexual assault perspective, looking for DNA, looking for semen, looking for hair samples, and then in a homicide investigation, they'll do it similarly, and that is done to look for any kind of biological evidence that can be attributed to anyone. Often there are sexual assaults or even in consensual sex acts that can then lead to evidence that could help law enforcement figure out an identity of someone that obviously was around the victim at the time or right before the time of death. So it's very important stuff. And right now the reporting is that the rape kit for Stephen Smith, so there was one done, has gone missing.
Uh-oh.
Wait, what? I don't think I knew that.
Has gone missing. So now that SLED is back on the case. They're unlocking phones and tablets. They're presumably re-interviewing witnesses. They're looking at all their evidence, and this rape kit has gone missing. And that's not normal.
No.
Luke and I have a case that we'll talk about in a future podcast where we had a rape kit go missing on a murder case where we were asserting it was someone else that was tied to law enforcement that actually did the killing. And it wasn't missing in that case. It was literally checked out and taken and never returned. And then returned without any information about whether it was the individual's actual rape kit or not. So this is actually just reported as missing. They can't find it. So in crime scene evidence terminology, this is really bad because evidence stays in the evidence room. And there are evidence custodians. You guys may have seen some movies about, there's like in a police station or a crime lab, there's some undervalued person, normally in the basement, that has glasses. They're behind a cage and they're always in charge of the evidence, and people are submitting them things and they're signing for it. But they're not checking stuff out unless it's used for court or for further testing. So you can't just walk something out. Stuff's not supposed to go missing. It's supposed to be there forever. Because let's say there's a case where someone gets found guilty and then they get exonerated due to DNA evidence or a confession by someone else, and then that person is on trial. You need the case evidence, and the case evidence just can't go away. It can be stored, but it can't just go missing. If it goes missing, then justice can't get done.
And it's critical. I went and viewed evidence last week in a gun trial just to make sure they had the gun. Because guess what? If it's like this, they don't have the gun, they don't have a case. So I just wanted to make sure it was there. It was worth my time. And I took our associate down there to go look at the gun, and the gun was there. And the evidence custodian was very, proper and had her stuff together. But you always learn something. And when I saw the gun, I said, "It's very dirty. What is all that?" She goes, "Well, that's where they dusted it for prints." Oh, okay. Well, that was a fact that had never cropped up in the case itself. as an item they tested for, so naturally I wanted to know what the result of that was. And so you always want to go look at the evidence. It's never good if it's gone.
Correct. So stay tuned for that.
That's
We'll have to see if the rape kit turns up after some deep digging by law enforcement, but it is, I mean, this case has some age on it, but it's also never been solved. Things like this shouldn't go missing. There's no real reason why evidence should not be found. That's a problem.
I watched with my 5-year-old, big off topic here, but kind of topic, this weekend, Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Maybe I shouldn't watch that with my 5-year-old. And the scene where they open the Ark and everybody's faces melt off was probably a little too much. But
yeah, probably too much.
But when you talk about evidence going missing and custodians and keeping all this evidence, the very last scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark is where they have the Americans now have the Ark and it's boxed up in this wooden box, and this bureaucrat is just pushing this box in this warehouse full of thousands of boxes that look just like it. And to me, I can imagine that that's somewhere like that is where the Stephen Smith rape kit is, just in a mountain of
that scene is, kind of previewed by, well, where's the Ark? Who's got it? And it's like our top people
Don't worry, our top people are working on
it. Well, who's that? Our top people. And then it just shows like some bureaucrat, storing it.
Some poor schlup just pushing this box of identical boxes. But
so, last bit on evidence, and we talked about the cell phones, we talked about the missing rape kit, the leftover money from that funded the autopsy, the new autopsy, and Dr. Kinsey and all that team, apparently the leftover money, which is approximately $35,000, has been made available to any kind of tips that lead to an arrest of the person that murdered Stephen Smith. So that it's an award, a reward. So we see stuff like this in a lot of our murder cases, and so that's a big chunk of money. I mean, normally the reward is not that much. Normally it's like $1,000 or $1,500. So this is a lot of money to a lot of people, and I imagine there are thousands. Tens of thousands of people calling SLED with tips to try to link people or what they've heard to this case, because they know if it leads to an arrest, they're going to get $35,000. And so for every legitimate lead that gets written down, well, then now there's an obligation for law enforcement to turn that over. And so if someone one day ever gets charged with murder, there's going to be about over 1,000 different, reports of people. So what it does is and again, it's just a unique case. It's unique in that there's so much coverage of this case. It's unique in the fact that there's an exhumation of a body and a top-notch pathology team involved, including Dr. Kinsey. It's unique that rape kits are missing. It's unique that there's a very well thought of pathologist that's getting ready to get scrutinized heavily, kind of even before a warrant's ever brought. All this stuff is new, very unique, but now we've got a big reward, and all that will have to be made available. And what law enforcement is going to do is track down all these leads, and some of them will absolutely come to nothing, and some of them will be interesting, and that'll lead to another phone call and maybe a witness interview, and all of that.
The one that I call in on will come to nothing. Nothing.
So, but bottom line is like, if a charge ever comes to anybody related to this case, there's just going to be a lot of built-in exculpatory material, because there's going to be leads that pan out that look pretty good, along with an initial pathologist report that says this was kind of a hit-and-run style death. And that leads us to the leads.
The suspects.
The leads are weak? You're weak.
Glenn
Ross. Go watch it.
So we'll dive in first to this tip that you guys have kind of been mentioning in the comments. Yes, there was a tip phoned in about Two, at the time, teenage boys, Patrick Wilson and Sean Connolly. I believe he's a celebrity. Just kidding. But what I find to be very interesting about that is that same tip was actually sent in years ago.
I've got it right here in Proctor's investigation.
We're going to read it right now. I'm going to pull it right up. It was sent in December of, let's see, go to our thread. It was sent in December 2015. So this is just months after Stephen Smith's body had been found. I received information from Captain Duncan about an individual, Daryl Williams. He is stating that his stepson, Patrick Wilson, told him that Sean Connolly struck and killed Stephen Smith. Mr. Williams stated that his son told him this is in confidence and that his son had moved out and that he did not know where he was staying. He could only tell me that Patrick attended some Christian school in Ridgeland. I drove down to Ridgeland and went to Step of Faith School. Patrick Wilson was not a student there. I then found Legacy Yuha Baptist Church School. Patrick Wilson is a student there but was not at school today. I then drove to Hampton attempting to locate an address for Patrick. I could not get his stepfather to return my calls. Mr. Williams stated that the reason that he was passing this information on was because Randy Murdaugh told him to call. That little bit some people have held on to, but also keep in mind at the time, it's very prominent. I guess he was a judge at the time. Anyway, so that tip was sent in 2015, months after Stephen Smith's body was found. And what came of that?
Very little, other than Proctor's attempt to talk to Patrick. He found his school, but he wasn't at school that day, so that was the end of the discussion. And then he did, at least it's not documented that he attempted to find Sean Connolly. And law enforcement has access to databases, skip trace, all that. They can find addresses and all that if they want. But that, in an entire MAPE report, that is the one page where it mentions that, which seems to be, it's the only evidence in this entire report that's not just rumor. It's at least a second-hand account where he says, look, my stepson said Sean Connolly struck and killed Stephen Smith.
And they were in the car apparently together at the time.
Well, and that's a little unclear, but yeah, so we're seeing some reporting now that says like, oh, these are our potential suspects.
But they were always there.
But they were always there. They certainly would be there for a hit and run investigation just as much or more than any potential murder. Because it doesn't say killed them because he's gay or killed him because they're best friends with a prominent family. They just said hit him with his truck.
Let's talk about regarding these two. So they could have been interviewed. They could have been search warrants could have been executed of their vehicles for preservation and processing
of their cell phones for location
data.
If you get these guys' cell phones in real time and they're actually right there at the same point of Stephen Smith's cell phone pinging at the time of his death, well, golly, you've got a case.
And just for a lot of our listeners and viewers, you can intentionally run someone over with your vehicle and get charged with murder easily. Just your vehicle is a weapon. Or you can be driving down the road when it's dark and just like you accidentally run over a possum or something or an animal, or you can hit somebody, but then it's not necessarily criminal unless you're intoxicated or unless you fail to render aid. So our hit and run statute in South Carolina, there is a provision, hit and run involving death. And so if you hit someone and you kill them and you are aware that you've struck someone and you don't call 911 or stay on the scene and render aid, if you just drive off because you're scared, that's a major felony. Mm-hmm. And that is a crime. It's easily prosecuted. Again, you have to have an identity of someone that did this, and you would be trying to match it by blood on a vehicle, geolocation data, interview techniques, trying to get them to confess, other people they told about it. So, I think a lot of maybe the media kind of has it that if it was a vehicle related incident, that it's not, that's so terrible because clearly it was intentional act. Well, yes, it can be intentional even if it was intentionally done, of course, with a vehicle, or if you accidentally hit someone with a vehicle and just failed to cop up to it, failed to do the right thing and stay on the scene and let people know what occurred. So, but then we've got maybe a more sinister suspect.
Well,
Yeah, a suspect that I find to be really, really interesting is Mark Bickhardt.
You're ready to turn Mark in.
I was. When I saw that the reward was posted, I was about to dial and put it in. So, cash out. Mark Bickhardt, we'll just take it to the beginning. Mark Bickhardt was, at the time, dating Stephen Smith, and at the time also 47. He was much older than Stephen. I believe that they found each other. Stephen Smith had posted a sexually explicit Craigslist ad, and that's how they found each other, which can be dangerous. I mean, Craigslist, we've heard time and time, many rumors, many different accounts of people who have met dangerous people on Craigslist. So that's how they kind of came to know each other. They were dating, they were in communication, and at the time of Stephen Smith's death, they were texting, and I believe even on the phone at one point leading up to when he was struck. Well, once the body was discovered, police definitely talked to this person multiple times, and he gave very inconsistent reports of what he believed to have happened, what he was doing, etc., etc. One day, after he had given his statement, the next day or a few days later, he incessantly was calling the investigator that spoke to him 13 times, unanswered calls. Seemed very paranoid, in my opinion. The investigator called him back. They spoke. It just kind of came to nothing. It was a bunch of bumbled, mumble jumbo that didn't really make sense. Well, then they did get in contact later again, and Mark Bickhardt claimed that he filed a police report that he had been getting harassing phone calls from these random people from the Cayman Islands threatening to do to him what was done to his friend, which is totally bizarre. And then also bizarre again, because then later he was saying that he was on the phone with Stephen and could hear the big mud tires and just are you saying that people from the Cayman Islands did this? Are you saying that some teenagers did this? Just doesn't make sense. A lot of inconsistencies. So taking all that into consideration, what I find to be very interesting is shortly after Stephen Smith's body was found, Mark Bickhardt up and left the state of South Carolina and moved to Florida. Gone. Peaced out.
Some would call that evidence of flight, which can be used in South Carolina to show guilt under our law.
Just saying, heard it here. But what's even crazier about that is then 9 months later, after Stephen Smith's body was found, 9 months, Mark Bickhardt was, wait for it, arrested for assault with a deadly weapon. I would love to know what that deadly weapon was and if it would somehow resemble similar injury that Stephen Smith took, but that's neither here nor there. And again, Mark Bickhardt since then has also moved again and is now, I believe, in Georgia. But that's just my 2 cents.
And I have no idea whether Mr. Bickhardt has anything to do with this, but what I enjoy is pointing out hypocrisy. And these cases are tied together by the Murdaugh trial only through insinuation, and we've covered all that ground. But in the Murdaugh trial, Alec Murdaugh, per SLED, the crackpot investigators, the husband, that loved one, is always in the circle of suspicion. And it's your job as the suspect to get yourself out of the circle of suspicion. And if you give inconsistent statements or have bizarre behavior where you try to claim that you're a victim, a la roadside shooting.
Or insert yourself into the case by saying that you were on the phone with Stephen Smith saying you heard big mud tires and like it sounded like a truck,
Right.
and Stephen Smith was concerned that he was being followed.
Right. All those things which have eerie similarities to the exact same behavior that Alec Murdaugh was maligned for, was said that is his evidence of his guilt. He's in the circle and he never got out. He just kept digging a hole in the circle. The same things are occurring with Mr. Burkhart, but he was just pretty much ignored and just left alone to go away without even a search warrant on his house, a search warrant on his phone.
To later get an aggravated assault in a different state.
With a deadly weapon.
Or maybe just even an in-office interview to kind of look him in the eye and go, all right, tell me again about the last
Nothing.
time you saw him. So like,
Of this man that you met on Craigslist.
right. But now there's just this interest where we got to get to the bottom. And he is still not even discussed as much as other people, such as, poor Buster, who had to put out public statements. So I just find that fascinating. I love to point out hypocrisy, and I just think let's just investigate cases and accuse people the same way. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. Let's just do it the same way.
But Bitcart hopefully is lawyered up at this point. He should be a major point of investigation for SLED. He was a much older man, stranger meeting off of Craigslist. He's referring to escort services and you only need to look at them, that they're dangerous,
Yep.
kind of inferring
He's doing a lot of projecting.
he's texting Stephen Smith like within 30 minutes of his death. He's purporting to hear Stephen call him, or he calls him, and there's big trucks, and Stephen's feeling concerned about being followed. He's fleeing the state shortly after and getting charged with kind of very similar type crimes. So I'm sure SLED is already taking a hard look at this guy, but that seems to be a good point of investigation.
But I would be very curious if they could issue a statement about how he got himself out of the circle of suspicion. That would help me sleep at night.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you ready?
Totally wild.
So Hannah's ready to cash in on
So
Bitcart.
that's.
I mean, you're officially doing it right now. You're saying, hey, SLED,
Yeah.
there's this guy that you had in your crosshairs back in 2015. Go look at him.
I'm gonna send the link to this podcast as my tip.
There you go. There you go.
But yeah.
What else? What we got?
What else do we got? I mean, a lot of people were saying that they hadn't heard that yet, but they do find that to be interesting. More questions kind of about the Murdaughs and how they were related. But, yes, I believe that Alex Murdaugh and Randy did arrive to the scene. And so Luke and I kind of discussed this two episodes ago. Does that seem suspicious? Perhaps, maybe a little weird. Also keeping in mind that this is a very small town, tight-knit community. It sounds like Buster and Stephen were in school together. So, and they were personal injury lawyers. Maybe they were chasing ambulances. You don't know. But I believe that Stephen Smith's father was using Randy Murdaugh for some sort of case already. And so, they may have been connected that way. Someone asked about evidence found at Moselle directly related to Stephen Smith. I believe there's nothing. And in fact, I think that was stated that no evidence has connected any Murdaugh.
So SLED did make that statement. And whether it was a kind of a PR mistake or whether it's something that actually happened, they're keeping a very tight lid on any evidence taken from Moselle. And honestly, they should. I mean, they shouldn't be leaking anything. If there is real evidence from Moselle and it's leading to different avenues in their investigation, that should be a top classified priority for them to follow up on that and see where it takes them without potentially, belittling their efforts by talking about it. So hopefully, if there is anything, they're keeping their mouth shut and just doing their jobs. But there is no public knowledge of what that evidence is, if there really is evidence from Moselle.
Yeah. I think we'll close here. If y'all have any questions, go ahead and drop them. We'll just kind of talk about maybe next steps, like what this will look like. Obviously, they are coming through the cell phone records, the tablet, which will be very interesting, as we all saw with the Murdaugh case. Any more information from the body or...
They're going to be forensically kind of dealing with it. So they're going to have... It will probably take a lot more time because they've got the anthropologist assisting the pathologist. So it'll probably take more time. They're going to want to get it right. And like I said, it's either going to be three things. Initial pathologist was right. Initial pathologist is wrong. Or we're still inconclusive. But certainly they are going to be issuing a very thorough report. And so that will aid law enforcement potentially as they're running up other leads. And then if I were Mr. Bickhart, I would be lawyered up and I'd be in some bunker someplace.
Get off social media.
Get off social media. But he would be a strong lead, I think, for law enforcement to be interviewing.
And then the question is there anything that Dr. Kinsey can run with? Mm-hmm. Are we going to have anything from the autopsy, some speck of hair or a reconstruction, or will there be some lead that he can track down? Let's say if a crime scene is determined that he can go investigate. Let's say they get a lead and say, guess what? It was murder and he was killed elsewhere. That could be right up Dr. Kinsey's wheelhouse.
Sure could.
Let's talk real quick, since we have mentioned Buster a lot. What could Buster do, like, in his position now with everything that's come out with, like, the very popular podcast that insinuate that he was related to this murder? Netflix nods at it. I believe the HBO documentary also insinuates. Like, what kind of ground does Buster have with everything that's been going on?
Well, I think he's drawn a line in the sand with his big statement that he released through his father's attorneys. I don't know if they're officially his attorneys, saying enough is enough. Stop defaming me. Mm-hmm. Because that's where you go. If someone without any evidence in the public sphere just puts out baseless accusations, they can get sued for defamation. And we've seen cases in local media where that, I think the biggest one I can think of right now is Dominion. What was it? The voting machines, Old Dominion. They were accused of having bad machines that led to election interference, and they just sued the crap out of somebody. So that's where...
Well, it was a news agency.
Oh, yeah, it was. I think it was the Murdaughs, maybe. Not Murdaughs, but the others.
Rupert Murdoch.
Rupert's, yeah. But, that's the threat, is if you talk loosely without any legal basis, you can get sued. And I think he's basically warning people that I'm prepared to do this, leave me alone, respect my privacy. And so hopefully that works. Other than that, you just try to keep your head down and live your life and not create any new news for any particular reason. So, but that's clearly what he's done with that public statement.
Right.
Well, awesome. Thank you to everyone that tuned in today for our live show. Again, just as a reminder, you can catch the full episode if you missed any bits. It will be uploaded to Spotify, Google, all of those streaming platforms. You can watch the full video episode on YouTube, and we will share, some of our favorite bits on our TikTok or Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff. So follow us on social media. Also, a new feature is you can now donate to Bring the Jury podcast to fuel our frenzy here. You can do that through our donation links that you can find on those social media platforms. It's in the link of every episode, like on Spotify or Google, also on our YouTube page and all of that. So we would love a little support. And if you all have any other questions about this case in particular or any other case kind of trending right now, feel free to send us a message. We're happy to discuss that in a later episode. Once again, this was Bring the Jury.
Bring the Jury.
Bring the Jury. And sadly, I believe we will not have an episode next week. We will miss you all next Monday.
There's a strong possibility we will be in our own attempted murder trial. So if we are... think of us. If not,
Hannah, you could just do it by yourself.
Just bash Mark.
No, wait for us.
Yeah. No.
Anyway.
We won't do that.
If
Y'all don't
not,
want to hear me do
We'll
that.
be live, but if we are, then we'll be working hard for our client.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you all so much.